All right, welcome back, everyone. Some big stories to go into. I want to talk a bit about what's happening with, the Chinese Communist Party holding assault drills right now around Taiwan. And these are not like the normal flyovers they've been doing. You might have heard the incursions into Taiwanese airspace. It's getting a little more serious now. And so I'm going to be talking about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, what this means. We're going to be going to a lot of other stories as well. You might have remembered the Durham report. We're all waiting for that Durham report to come out. Well, there's now some pressure to make that public once it does come out. 44 U.S. senators, Republicans, are calling for that to be publicly released. A lot more going on. We'll talk with the Taliban, a few other issues. And folks, a lot of stories to go into. That said, I have a few announcements, actually. First of all, folks, you might remember we've been talking about this Dark Origins of Communism series. We now have episode 2 coming out. That's going to be coming out this Saturday. And so be sure to check it out. That's, again, August 21st on Saturday. If you haven't seen the first episode, be sure to check it out. It's on Epoch TV, epochtv.com/Crossroads. If you don't have an Epoch TV account, all you need is an email address to get a free trial. So check it out, folks. Episode 2 coming out this Saturday, so be sure to check it out. That said, I'll show you a quick trailer of that, and then we'll jump into a few more announcements. Then we'll get into the main stories for the night. Jump into that. Communism is a belief in the destruction of belief. It destroys religion wherever it goes. So who is the unholy father of communism? François-Noël Gracchus-Babeuf. The French Revolution would be remembered for its unjust bloodshed, killing over 300,000 people. It was a period known as the Reign of Terror. All right, I've been looking forward to doing this one for a long time. So again, this is going to be an ongoing series, at least for a while. We have several episodes already recorded, several of them set to be released. And these are shorter, 7 to 10 minutes roughly. Some might be a little longer, but really touching on different parts of the history of communism that most people have probably never heard about. Getting into more of the ideology eventually. A lot to talk about with this. Again, folks, that series is going to be exclusively on Epoch TV, epochtv.com. Be sure to check it out. And again, all you need is an email address if you want a free trial, so check it out. A couple more updates real quick before we jump into the stories. We're going to do a special live Q&A on August 24th. That's going to be next week. And so, folks, be sure to tune in as well. We're going to have on the panel Gordon Cheng, one of the top China experts, Greg Copley, Casey Fleming, and Nan Su, some real good China experts, talking about this cyber issue, but really taking the discussion beyond cyber into what's really going on. I think the bigger picture that no one really touches on, that you very rarely hear, I'd say. That's going to be August 24th, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. So be sure to tune in. That's going to replace the live that we do next week. And so be sure, again, if you want to tune in for the live next week on August 24th, we're going to be airing it a bit early. So that's 7:30 p.m. Be sure to check it out. And also, folks, I'm doing something crazy. I'm going on a semi-vacation, not a full vacation. I'm still going to be doing the lives next week, but I'll be on the road again for a bit. Finally, for once, doing some fun stuff, which is more for myself, I guess. Which is again, I'm going to be doing the live Q&As still, but taking a few days off, which I've been looking forward to. Also, though, I will be not this weekend, but next weekend, speaking at a couple events in California. So for those of you around California, you want to come say hi, you want to come to the events, we're going to be doing one in Irvine and also one in San Francisco. In San Francisco, it's going to be a luncheon that's in Los Altos Hills in California on August 29th. If you want to join that, you can RSVP, send an email to Edith Wong. That's edithwang, edith.wang at Epoch Times, epochtimes.com. And so again, 2 events I'm going to be speaking at. If you want to come say hi, you want to join, send an email to her, RSVP. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into the stories for the night. And as always, it's great seeing you all here. Absolute Zeri said, enjoy your break. Thank you. In addition to all the stuff you see here, I've been working on a few other things. Some I can't announce just yet. and I've been kind of biting my tongue, wanting to tell you all about them. I can give you a big hint that I'm working on a new documentary, not just a special feature, but more of a full-length documentary again. And I think you're all going to very, very much like it. I think it's going to be a necessary discussion to be having right now. So be sure to check that out. And so I'm going to be taking a couple days off because of that. Yeah. Florida girl, you said hint. Yeah, I do like to tease you all on that. I'm sorry. The one and only Pinky, good to see you here as always. Judith McWhorter, you said, hey, Josh, good to see you. All right, folks, let's jump into the first story for the night. I want to talk about China. And again, as always, if you have questions, leave them in the chat, or on the halfway point, we'll get to them. So first of all, it says here, China holds assault drills near southern Taiwan. And it says this: China carried out assault drills near Taiwan on August 17th with fighter jets, anti-submarine aircraft, and combat ships exercising to the southwest and southeast of the island. 2 different points there. And what the country's armed forces said was a response to external interference. Remember, technically the Chinese Communist Party is the external interference to Taiwan. Let's be clear on this. Taiwan is a self-governing nation. It was recognized as the official government of China. I mean, up until I think Jimmy Carter. The Chinese Communist Party was seen as the unofficial government of China. You still have Taiwan being a self-governing island. The CCP claims ownership over it. And anybody who tries to support Taiwan, the CCP calls external interference. They call it external interference. Now, in an August 17th statement, the People's Liberation Army, which is the official armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party, not like a normal military. It's a party military, not meant to protect the country, but to protect the party, the Communist Party. Their Eastern Theater Command said the drills were, quote, using actual troops, and that recent U.S.-Taiwan provocations severely violated the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So as the CCP is threatening war with Taiwan, they're accusing other countries of, say, violating and causing trouble with peace and stability. Peace and stability as they threaten war. Now, Taiwan, which is claimed by the Chinese regime, despite the island having been ruled as a separate entity for decades, has complained of repeated Chinese military drills in its vicinity in the past 2 years. The PLA drills, that's People's Liberation Army drills, have been widely viewed as part of a pressure campaign to force the island to accept China's rule over it. The assault drills are different. This is the important part. These assault drills we're seeing taking place are different than those carried out as a matter of routine by the PLA. The Chinese Communist Party often does these incursions into Taiwanese airspace. They often fly jets into their airspace. This is different. This is a different beast we're dealing with on these assault drills. The August 17th drills were held near Taiwan's southwestern and southeastern waters, in both the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea, as well as the Bashi Channel that connects the 2 seas, according to the PLA's statement. Now, as we're speaking right now, the Chinese Communist Party is, while threatening Taiwan yet again, they're pointing to the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, and they're saying, look, the U.S. didn't protect the Afghanis. How is it going to protect you? We're speaking to the Taiwanese people. They're using that as an example, saying that if you're aligning yourself with the United States, you're risking falling into the same hole that the Afghan people did as the Taliban was able to take over the country. That's what they're saying right now. Also, the CCP has been threatening forceful takeover of Taiwan for quite a while now, especially, I think, on the heels of what happened with Hong Kong, where the Chinese Communist Party ended the one country, 2 systems policy, where Hong Kong was a democratic country, and the CCP just decided to throw out all those agreements in one day. A lot going on with this. One of the big questions is going to be whether other countries step in to support Taiwan. And actually, a very interesting development with this, Japan is now showing signs of doing this. And with the Quad Alliance being the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, having a defensive alliance in the region, if Japan steps forward to protect them, to protect Taiwan, that means very likely other nations will step forward as well. We see some signs starting with this. We'll get into that in just a minute. Real quick, though, folks, I've mentioned we're still totally demonetized by YouTube. If you want to support Crossroads, be sure to check out Epoch TV, epochtv.com/Crossroads. That's our new uncensored video platform. Our exclusive interviews are there. Our special features are there. Our documentaries are there. And a lot of other channels and other shows we're looking to get are there as well. So be sure to check it out. That said, folks, we also have sponsors who have been doing really great, helping us keep the show going. And tonight's episode is brought to you by American Hartford Gold. Now, with all the turbulence in the economy, multi-trillion dollars in spending, China threatening currency war against the United States, tariffs, lockdowns, labor shortages, and inflation now taking place that we've been talking about for a while, you can consider investing in something that tends to be stable and on the incline. That's gold and that's silver. American Hartford Gold is one of the highest rated firms in the country with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. They can have your gold and silver delivered right to your doorstep or into your IRA. To learn more, you can check out the link in the description below. American Hartford Gold has provided a free 25-page information guide. That's totally free. You just want to learn about investing in gold or silver, check it out. It's in the description below. And if you call them now, you can get up to $1,500 of free silver in all qualifying first orders. The number for that is 877-260-2764. You can also text Joshua to 65532. And big thanks out to American Hartford Gold for sponsoring tonight's episode. Real quick as well, this is one of the silver bars you can get from them. And got to get the light right because it reflects it, and you can see. This is one of the silver bars, actually. It's smaller. It's in this little package. This is one of the silver coins. So just an idea of what you get with them. And again, big thanks out, American Hartford Gold. Thanks again for sponsoring tonight's episode. And folks, if you want to find out about investing in gold or silver, again, check out that free information guide. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into a few more stories about what Japan is doing right now as it relates to Taiwan, because this is an important factor when we're talking about the possibility of the U.S. getting pulled into a conflict or Taiwan being invaded and all these other conflicts we're facing right now. Afghanistan being another one possibly, which we'll talk about. A lot happening. Now, let's jump into what's happening with Japan real quick. It says here, Japan's defense of Taiwan, a response to CCP moral threat, according to one of our experts. It says here, Japan announced earlier this month that it will deploy 500 to 600 military personnel to the southwestern island of Ishigaki, which is near Taiwan, in a move that experts say will solidify the country's commitment of defending Taiwan from Chinese Communist Party aggression. You hear that, folks? So Japan's defense ministry has been saying now for a little bit that it is a duty in some regards, a responsibility in some regards to possibly defend Taiwan if the Chinese Communist Party were to invade it. They haven't made a real official announcement on this, but they are now deploying 500 to 600 military personnel to, again, this island, which is very close to Taiwan. This is being seen as Japan's move to protect Taiwan if the Chinese Communist Party were to try to attack it. And again, with the Quad Alliance, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States having an alliance, a defensive alliance, which was perceived under the Trump administration as being formed to challenge and try to prevent Chinese aggression. Other countries could get pulled into it if this moves forward. We'll see what happens with it. Let's go a bit more into it. It says here, the development is also part of a larger shift in Japanese policy towards increasing international military cooperation aimed at countering the CCP, according to experts. The new units, expected to be operational by 2022, will be drawn from various elements of Japan's self-defense forces, the SDF, and include both surface-to-ship and ground-to-air missiles. Now, as this is happening, there's a few other important points with this. The Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping right now appears to be walking the steps that Mao Zedong took. They're rolling back a lot of the economic programs that were started under Deng Xiaoping. Now, brief history on this. Chinese Communist Party takes over China. The official government of China at that time, the Kuomintang, flees to the island of Formosa, now Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party establishes a totalitarian communist system in China. They start multiple campaigns under Mao Zedong alone, killing between 50 million and 70 million Chinese people, destroying the Chinese culture, desecrating the country, desecrating temples, and doing everything they can to remake China under the image of this new Communist Party. Mao Zedong did not originally have full control over it. Just like Xi Jinping right now, he was not chairman at all times. Xi Jinping now is walking some of the same steps that Mao Zedong took to become chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, which means total control over the CCP. Now, under Deng Xiaoping, a few leaders ago, so there was Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping in terms of leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. Deng Xiaoping took over the country and rolled back a lot of the Maoist reforms, a lot of the Maoist programs that Mao Zedong brought in. Among the big changes he made was basically under Mao Zedong, all businesses were controlled by the military in China. It was really kind of full communism in a lot of regards. They rolled back some of those programs because, as many communist systems soon find, while communism doesn't really work in practice, you implement it fully, you're going to find the system falling to pieces very quickly. The CCP was facing that reality. The Chinese Communist Party was facing the collapse of the global communist system. Soviet Union collapsing around the late 1980s, early 1990s. And really the CCP having to reform in order to survive. What do? Deng Xiaoping comes in. They do the Tiananmen Square massacre around this time as well, 1989. But he creates this new movement of reforming and opening up, bringing in some capitalist systems, which the Chinese Communist Party still controls. They call it state capitalism. Now they create the State Council, which is still under the CCP technically the government of China, still under the Communist Party, and they moved control of a lot of these businesses from under the military, the PLA, to the State Council. And they call this the bringing of capitalism to China. It was not capitalism, it was still socialism. Now, a lot of the programs, though, that Deng Xiaoping created at that time, the CCP is now starting to roll back, meaning they're now transitioning back to a more full Maoist system. Let's go into what's happening with that, because Xi Jinping is doing some interesting stuff right now with this. It's important to watch. It says here, Xi Jinping, again, the head of the Chinese Communist Party currently, eyes clampdown on China's rich and bid to redistribute wealth. Right? It says here, the Chinese regime's top leadership has signaled a hardening stance toward the country's affluent in a bid to promote common prosperity. It says here, it's the latest campaign aimed at tackling the country's rising inequalities, which analysts say reveals Beijing's anxiety over the issue. In an economic planning meeting with top leaders on August 17th, Xi Jinping called for readjusting, quote, excessively high income, eliminating illicit gains and boosting the earnings of low-income class. High-income individuals, he said, and companies are encouraged to give more back to the society, according to a readout published by state news agency Xinhua, the official voice of the Chinese Communist Party. The speech followed a months-long clampdown on China's private sector that focused on industries from tech to education. It also came after the Chinese Communist Party declared victory against poverty earlier this year, which many people noted was really a false claim because they basically played with the numbers. It was not a legitimate claim. But it claimed it had lifted nearly 100 million people out of destitution. Xi's plan, which remains vague in terms of how it will be accomplished, highlights issues with unequal basic public services, healthcare, social welfare, and housing assistance. In other words, folks, we've discussed before that the Chinese Communist Party, basically at the social level, is risking collapse. Remember, we've been talking about this? What's the CCP doing? They're trying to appease the underclass, trying to appease the average Chinese citizen, and really getting rid of a lot of these billionaires that the CCP that have been created by the ability of people to start their own businesses, even though the CCP still technically controls a lot of these businesses. They're starting to target a lot of these people, which is going to bring a lot of interesting discussions forward on foreign direct investment on China, what this means for foreign businesses in China. One of the big things the CCP also did related to this was made it so that even foreign businesses, if Microsoft or Apple or LinkedIn is working in China, they now made it so any Western country operating in China now has to follow the directives of the Chinese Communist Party. If the CCP sanctions a U.S. official, any foreign company operating in China has to recognize and support those sanctions, which is going to bring up some really, I think, tough decisions for these companies in terms of international allegiance. And you had companies like Nike saying that they're of China and for China, and quotes like this. Now, a bit more on this. Accomplishing common prosperity, what they're saying right now, is a basic requirement of socialism. and necessary for promoting social fairness and justice, according to the Xinhua article. So anyone claiming that China is not socialist, folks, they call themselves socialist. They dictate socialism. They have to study communist books. They're led by the Communist Party of China. They talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics. Yes, they're socialist in every single regard. The party brought forth the idea of common prosperity during the regime's early years. Again, this goes back to what I was saying, that they're rolling back a lot of these economic reform programs. The first CCP ruler, Mao Zedong, promoted the phrase that they're now using and a push for collective farming, a policy that contributed to a devastating 3-year famine in the late 1950s that killed tens of millions of people. In the 1980s, then leader Deng Xiaoping, known for his economic reform policies, encouraged also a portion of people to get rich first. And that was how they basically framed the idea of reform and opening up. Now, important developments to watch. The Chinese Communist Party is again reversing a lot of these policies as they're doing this. They're also targeting a lot of people within the party itself. They're holding new purges, including using the exact same names that Mao Zedong used to purge members of their own party, namely under the bloodiest purge of the communists within the Communist Party that they had. They're now using that again, bringing out these names again. You're seeing a lot of these same policies brought back. But those of you who've been watching the show for a while know that this was coming. As we discussed, the CCP has a 3-tiered plan for bouncing back from this virus, which they're going to be promoting globally. The 3-tiered plan the 3-tiered plan is vaccine passports, these health codes on your smartphones, which means all the emergency powers they've given themselves and other countries have given themselves, they're going to be keeping. The idea of the vaccine passport is all these emergency programs, all the rights that they seized from the average citizen, the people in power are going to keep. Your freedoms, your rights are no longer yours as long as these policies are in place. They're given back to you under condition, namely under condition that you follow whatever directives they have in place. And you're given a pass on your phone that you can show to people, this vaccine passport. In China, it's the again on your smartphone, these three colored color-based systems they use to determine your freedom. It's the same system they're promoting that basically means the government is granting you back the rights that they've taken from you under conditions, certain conditions that you have to meet. That's one thing with it. The other thing they're promoting is going to be this new digital currency, which means all transactions are controlled by the state. These are not like cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies hide your identity. Cryptocurrencies make it so they can't track you. These are state-run digital currencies under the state centralized banks. What this means is that as opposed to cryptocurrencies that hide your identity, these things monitor every single purchase you make. And as long as the Communist Party or whatever system controls it, it means that any purchase can be approved or denied by the party. And if you have a too low of a citizen score and or things like the social credit system, they can cancel you. Maybe you go to the store and you find you can't buy food anymore. Things like this. And the third one of this is the one related to what we're discussing right now. The third part of this is going to be what they call state capitalism. In China, they're calling it the mixed model economy. Basically, state capitalism, those of you who watch the show know, this goes back to Vladimir Lenin shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, again, one of the founders of the Soviet Union, where he declared shortly after taking over Russia, he wrote an article entitled, it was along these lines, it was something like, how can we advance to communism if we fear the stage of socialism? Keep in mind that communism is like the belief, socialism is the form it takes when in power. Communism is like what they use. It's a carrot on the stick used to lure them along. Socialism is always the form of government that communism takes, because communism exists through the negation of systems. You can't have a socialist system and communism at the same time. It's the belief they hold that directs the whole thing. Socialism is the form of government it takes when in power. And so Lenin, of course, after holding his culture, communist revolution, says, looks like you're not totally liberated yet. We're going to form this totalitarian dictatorship and maybe kill a few million of you in the process. But this is necessary. This is part of the state capitalist monopoly, he called it. That's the name he used for socialism, meaning the state has seized the elements of capitalism. State capitalism seized the means of production. The businesses are controlled by the state. State capitalism. That's the key word they're going to start using for socialism. Already you can find New York Times promoting it. The CCP is calling this the mixed model economy. This latest development we're talking about is related to that, as the CCP is moving forward with this. So important to watch as well as they try to do similar things in the West. All right, folks, that said, I'll be getting into questions in just a bit. So again, if you do have questions, leave them in the chat. But I want to talk real quickly about this Durham report because, folks, you may be wondering where John Durham is. Bit of history on this. Under Donald Trump, when he was still president, his Justice Department under Barr appointed John Durham as special counsel to investigate Crossfire Hurricane. Crossfire Hurricane was the Obama policy where they spied on the Trump campaign. Different government agencies, FBI and so on, appeared to have been weaponized to some degrees to spy on political adversaries of the Democratic Party at that time. Trump was one of the targets of that. Many people were involved within that campaign. The DNC and the Clinton campaign financed through Fusion GPS Christopher Steele, who went and created this, the dossier, the Trump-Russia dossier, which was allegedly collected from information handed to them by Russian agents, ironically, because that's what they were accusing Trump of having done, which they themselves actually did, meaning that Russian disinformation framed the narrative that Trump was spreading Russian disinformation, basically, using it to interfere with the election, which is exactly what they did. This is common Sololinsky tactics: accuse your enemy of what you're guilty of, accuse your enemy of what you yourself are doing. They accused Trump of spreading Russian disinformation, of being involved with Russia to interfere in the elections. The very report that was used to frame that narrative was itself Russian disinformation financed by political actors, going back to collusion with government agencies that were using it to spy on Trump and his campaign, basically. Now, John Durham was appointed special counsel to investigate this and also was given the ability to prosecute as special counsel. Anyone remember Robert Mueller? You might remember the memes. It's Mueller time, where everyone was talking about how Mueller was going to go after Trump and Trump was going to go to prison, and then it never happened, and the whole thing ended up falling to pieces, although some people may still believe it. Well, that was a special counsel. Durham is also a special counsel. We've heard absolutely nothing from him. Now, Durham was originally supposed to release his report detailing his findings through his investigation. Before he never released it, we found he was appointed special counsel instead, which gives him more power, technically, if he were to ever do something. But we're not hearing anything on what he's doing, but now there's an update on it. Let's go into it. It says here, this is Epoch Times, 44 Senate Republicans demand John Durham report be made public. And it says here, the pending report from special counsel John Durham, who was tasked with investigating the origins of the FBI's Trump-Russia probe, should be released to the public, demanded Senate Republicans in a letter this week. More than 40 GOP senators, including Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, signed a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland asking that Durham, a former U.S. attorney, should be allowed to continue his investigation and his report released to the public. There have been questions about whether Durham's investigation will lack funding past the end of the federal government's fiscal year on September 30th. He was tapped by then Attorney General William Barr to investigate the FBI's operation, when it surveilled former President Trump's 2016 campaign. And Barr elevated Durham to become special counsel last October. I'll go a bit more into this a bit further down. It says here, the special counsel's ongoing work is important to many Americans who were disturbed that government agents subverted lawful process to conduct inappropriate surveillance for political purposes, according to the letter from the Republican senators. They added, the truth pursued by the investigation is necessary to ensure transparency in our intelligence agencies and restore faith in our civil liberties. Thus, it is essential that the special counsel's ongoing review should be allowed to continue unimpeded and without undue limitations. The Republicans called on Garland to make a pledge to release the full report and allow John Durham to investigate past September. In other words, folks, there's a possibility they may try to cancel the ability of John Durham to finish his investigation because they can cancel the finances for it. Senate Republicans are asking for that to not happen. And they added this: we are over 2 years into the investigation of how the Obama-Biden FBI spied on an incoming president, and we still do not have answers. America's national security apparatus was weaponized to take down President Trump. And the American people deserve to know how this occurred. That's according to Senator Marsha Blackburn, who was leading the effort on this. She said that in a statement. Now, one brief update as well. In recent months, there have been scant reports about the progress of John Durham's investigation. But according to a report from the Wall Street Journal on August 13th, just recently, Durham's investigation is still active and is presenting evidence to a grand jury. That's according to the Wall Street Journal. They reported that, noting anonymous sources. So take it for what it's worth. Wall Street Journal did report on August 13th that Durham's investigation is both active and is currently presenting evidence to a grand jury. That's according to Wall Street Journal, based on anonymous sources. So take it for what it's worth, folks. We have seen how anonymous sources sometimes play out once they're actually exposed. Take it for what it's worth. But that's the biggest update we've gotten on this in a very long time. All right, that said, I'm going to go into what's happening with Afghanistan in just a bit, but first let's go into some questions. And folks, again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. But briefly, again, I mentioned we're still totally demonetized by YouTube. It seems to be indefinite at this point. We did try to get our monetization restored, have the ability to have advertisements again, have the ability to have super chat yet again. It's not happening, folks. They didn't give us a clear reason on even why they censored us in the first place. They said a channel connected to our account violated their standards. They didn't say which channel. They didn't say which video. They didn't say how or what was violated or anything like that. We know no details whatsoever. And so it does appear that we are indefinitely at this point demonetized by YouTube. But folks, again, we have created our own platform. That's Epoch TV, epochtv.com/Crossroads. If you want to support Crossroads, please check out Epoch TV. If you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or a family member about Epoch TV. And that said, I want to show you a quick trailer of some of what we're working on over there right now.
Google deplatformed us twice due to this video.
On television, it's been analyzed, and people thought that what I said was totally appropriate.
One of the big arguments in the United States right now is whether Trump incited violence and incited these quote-unquote riots on January 6th.
Nobody sued Trump as a person who is inciting violence.
Go home and go home in peace.
The court in Brazil saw the translation, a legally certified translation, showing that Trump did not incite.
How does this align with the communist tactic as you described it?
They need to make people familiar with some accusations. Even these accusations, there's no connection to the reality. It doesn't make sense for them. I mean, they don't care. It's a very clear communist action.
All right, so that's our interview with Orlando Santos of Terce Livre, the largest independent media in Brazil. Actually, interesting story. They were censored by YouTube in Brazil for posting a video of one of Trump's speeches. A court in Brazil, it was a state court, not the Supreme Court. I think I made a mistake actually saying it was a Supreme Court. Technically a state court, which is equivalent to like our state Supreme Courts. It's technicality. But the state court in Brazil, one of them determined that while Google was unjust in censoring the channel because of that video. Basically, the court there reviewed one of Trump's speeches and determined that Google censoring it, again, YouTube is run by Google, that Google censoring it was unjust. And they said basically that Trump did not incite violence in his speech as he was accused of doing, and that any type of censorship of things like this is not right because it's the job of journalists and something they have to do to present to people the facts, the context of what was said, and to be able to report the news. If platforms restrict our ability to report the news, then how can we have journalism? It's a great interview exclusively on Epoch TV, so be sure to check it out, folks. All right, let's jump into the questions for the night. First up is from Cameron Bacon. You said, Josh, you're familiar with the mislabeling of America as a democracy. Yes, we are a constitutional republic, not a democracy. Our founding fathers are very much against the idea of democracy. Again, if you want to learn more about that, check out the documentary I did, which is called America Rewritten, also on Epoch TV. You added as well, you said, I believe it's the same when calling America capitalist. Actually, this is true. You said America is a free enterprise system. This is true, and it's hard to talk about because a lot of people don't know what the alternative was or the system that America used to have. Actually, I don't have all my books with me because I have a lot of them at the office. There's a great book you can read, a collection of articles from, his name is G.K. Chesterton, right? So G.K. Chesterton, writer in the early 1900s, actually, he's pretty famous in conservative circles for his writings, but a lot of people don't know that he actually had a magazine. It was a weekly magazine called G.K.'s Weekly. You can find some of his articles from it in his collected works. I have a copy of some of his newspaper clippings, which are fantastic. But G.K.'s Weekly actually noted in one of its first articles, when he notes the reason for starting it, that he is, again, starting it to oppose communism, but he notes other forms of totalitarianism. He actually mentions capitalism. This idea of capitalism and communism as being things that really detract from the founding principles of America. And for us these days, that may seem very far-fetched because Americans are like, what do you mean you oppose the free market? How can you oppose the free market and oppose communism? Because isn't communism, basically the opposite of capitalism? It's a bit more complicated than that. Other writers, Ludwig von Mises, for example, in his books like Socialism. If you want to listen to a great audiobook detailing a lot of this, check out Planned Chaos by Ludwig von Mises. You can find some great readings of it on YouTube, as a matter of fact. It's about 3 hours long, I believe. I think Vox Stoica did a really good version of it, if you want to check it out. Ludwig von Mises noted that many people, when they criticize the free market economies, when they criticize these systems, the real irony you have is that oftentimes they're criticizing the interventionist policies that were introduced into the free market. That even in the early 1900s, already the things that we consider to be the free market had already been deeply subverted by interventionist socialist policies. The things we have today are really collectivist businesses. They're technocrats. Technocracy was an idea in the early 1900s as well. The idea that you could implement socialism through big tech, technocracy. You had these syndicalists believing you could implement socialism through the use of things like unions and so on. You had the fascists, the idea that you can implement socialism through this merging of the corporate structure and the government. All these things, folks. You had the introduction of centralized banking, things like the Federal Reserve, which really created debt traps for the entire nation. The loss of even having legitimate finances, that you could enslave people, essentially, by getting them stuck in debt traps through which the fruits of their labor are no longer theirs. How do you define slavery? It's where you're working without getting the fruits of your own labor because they steal some of it, right? That's how debt traps work. Changes made to our income taxes, the things that were not allowed in the United States originally, have been introduced into this country. All of these things are rooted in these same interventionist policies. Not to say that taxes historically didn't exist or things like usury didn't exist in history, but communism does support these things as well. A lot of what people would criticize, ironically, both in capitalism and in the free markets and so on, are rooted in interventionist policies a lot of times. The things we criticize in the broken medical system in this country are rooted in interventionist policies. The things we criticize about high school costs, high college costs, are rooted in interventionist policies. People are criticizing the communist policies introduced into the, say, free market system. Now, ironically, if you go back to the early 1900s, it was the conservatives who were criticizing the rise of big industry, of big business. This idea of domination of the free markets by corporate structures, collectivist companies, right? The whole idea of corporatism was the idea of collectivist companies that could have additional protections granted to them by the government, including legal protections that allowed them to do things that the average citizen cannot do. These are collectivist, publicly traded systems. And yes, you could say that these came about through the introduction of collectivist, state interventionist policies within the free market, which allowed for a lot of these big systems to develop. I think the idea of a free enterprise and free market shouldn't be confused with corporatism, shouldn't be confused with the way the unions took over and really created mafia states. with the way that, again, all these different corrupt systems, through a lot of times government interventionist policies, getting additional protections, we're able to have additional freedoms or additional protections that the average free market can't really compete with. And so it's a complicated system. I would like to do something more in depth on it. It's a lot to get into right now. Because again, if you say you oppose capitalism, people think you're a socialist or communist and think you're supporting these. I'd say the language is confused. I would say capitalism is a good thing. The problem we have is that the systems introduced into the capitalist system deviate from the free market system that we once had. The capitalist system we have is convoluted by interventionist policies. And it's these interventionist policies, not capitalism technically, that are the problem. Another question here, you said, do you believe big tech is showing the negative aspects of capitalism? Absolutely. I'd say a lot of them are technocrats. I'd say a lot of them are basically operating under government subsidies, government protections, things like Section 230 protections, and basically getting taxpayer money and additional protections that allow them to dominate things in a way they should never be allowed to dominate, that allow them to trample on the rights of the average citizen in ways they should never be able to. That basically we're creating socialist states within the free market economy because of these protections they're being given. And I mean, this is one of the other concerns. I mean, if you get into like syndicalism, if you get into the idea of technocracy, if you get into the ideas that people were playing with, even Marx talking in Das Kapital, where in the beginning of Das Kapital, he criticized, I mean, it's a thick book. In the beginning of Das Kapital, he's criticizing the markets and he's criticizing the factories, but in the end, he's praising them. Why is that? Why is it that Karl Marx in Das Kapital criticizes all of these different economic systems and criticizes the businesses and criticizes the factories, but by the end of it, he's praising them? And he's talking about the remaking of the entire industries in the image of man. He's talking about this high-tech communism. You might have even seen New York Times articles talking about this high-tech communism, the real vision that Marx had. It's because they don't get rid of these things. They don't get rid of the factories. Can we name a single communist or socialist country that got rid of these things? No. They put it under a centralized power structure, and they deny it to the average citizen. That's all it is. If you want to get into the depth, the real deep parts of this, I think we could do, I could do a whole documentary just on this. But if you get into the real deep parts of this, communism was never about economics. The debate ended on economics because it could not win the debate on economics. Could not win the debate on economics or sociology. It was always a metaphysical system. It's a belief about the destiny of man, right? It's really more like a cult or a religion, technically. It's a belief. And it's a belief that reinterprets the entire history of mankind and the future of mankind and tries to lock history into this whole utopian idea. It would be a lot to get into for one night, but basically it's about remaking society in the image of man rather than the image of tradition and gods, of overturning restraints on morality and restraints from culture and traditions and concepts that we have, overturning all of this, the negation of the negation, they called it, where you negate all previously existing institutions, not just businesses, but even family structures, even cultures, traditions, morality, God, religion, everything. And recreating man in the image of man. They believe that's the realization of the destiny of man. That was the idea of communism, not about getting rid of businesses. And you could say that a lot of these big businesses are doing this. Big tech is doing this. And they're working hand in hand with totalitarian governments. That's what we're witnessing right now. They're working hand in hand, implementing policies that can trample our rights because of some of the freedoms they've been given and some of the additional powers they've been given, again, through interventionist policy. You also asked, did I watch Jan's interview with Yeonmi Park on American thought leaders? I have not yet, but I plan to watch it. This is, again, a North Korean defector. We have another show, American Thought Leaders, also on Epoch TV, so check it out. Great interview. It looked like, I haven't watched it yet, but again, these are people who, this is a woman who escaped North Korea. Now, there's another question here from Candace Perkins. You say, this is AKA Perky 2CD. He said, Josh, what do you make of Canadian Trudeau saying he spoke with Hillary Clinton about Afghanistan? Question. I mean, it's possible. The Clintons have always done advisory stuff under the, the whole, what do you call it there? Clinton Foundation, they all have these foundations. Basically, they do go around giving talks and so on. They do these things. It's not unusual, I'd say. But yeah, I mean, who knows what they talked about, right? This is from Greg, and the important part with the Taliban, I would say, is that the Chinese Communist Party invited Taliban representatives to China right before this whole thing went down, which has me really seriously wondering whether the Chinese Communist Party helped arrange the tactics and strategy the Taliban would use to carry out exactly what they just carried out, and especially if it means shielding them from, well, responses from the United Nations, or trying to keep in line other countries from responding by using their systems of influence. That the CCP may have been working directly with the Taliban on this. While ironically, many countries are fighting the Taliban, the CCP was working with them behind the scenes, it appears. Question here from Books for You. Posted a few times. You said, more than a year ago, you said the CCP will fall within a year. People will rebel against them. It hasn't happened. What do you think about China's resilience? Yeah, so last year, I'd say, well, prior to the elections, the 2020 elections, when Biden became president, I was saying the Chinese Communist Party would probably collapse within a year. I at the time, that was very likely the case. The Chinese Communist Party economically was falling to pieces. Trump was hitting them hard with sanctions and tariffs. He restricted their chips, right? Huawei, not able to manufacture chips anymore, meaning the entire Chinese high-tech industry is about to collapse unless those sanctions get lifted. Meaning that a lot of it's going to shift to Taiwan with TSMC. TSMC now looking to make a chip manufacturing plant in the US as well. The Chinese Communist Party's high-tech systems collapsing, a lot of its systems of, well, being the manufacturing hub of the world falling apart. Even India and Japan were paying companies to leave China. You had a severe, I think, destabilization happening at the social level. I'd say this is all still happening. Some of that was from the lockdown policies and other policies. Some of that was from Chinese going out and losing their businesses, from, again, companies pulling out and so on. Some of that was from the CCP shutting down and locking things down because of the virus. Some of that was from the floods and other disasters across China. And the CCP's really not very good at all response to those disasters, which are back again, notably. As well, you have the CCP having a lot of internal fighting within the party itself. I mean, all these factors, the CCP's forceful takeover of Hong Kong, Taiwan electing into its government the party that's most opposed to the CCP, winning by a landslide over the Kuomintang, which ironically was originally the anti-CCP party, but has become more pro-CCP. All these things working together to basically lead to what looked like the very quick collapse of the CCP on the horizon. The Communist Party at that time was talking about responses to this. One of the responses they had planned, and they were really seriously talking about, was the idea of just basically locking down the country, closing borders, and they seem to be doing this right now. They're even now taking away people's passports. They're not giving out passports or visas anymore. They're actually doing a lot of these. They're moving forward a lot of what we discussed last year. Locking down the country, basically holding again some of these purges and political campaigns, rewalking the steps of Mao Zedong. They're actually doing this right now. We just discussed that they're remaking these purges within the party itself. We just discussed how they're using the same language that Mao Zedong used before the famines took place in China, using the exact same language that he used. They're restricting, again, taking away people's passports. They're bringing lockdowns back. They're making it so people can't leave the country, which again is what they were talking about doing last year in order to maintain social stability and ensure the survival of the CCP, even if it means killing a lot of Chinese people in the process. Everything we talked about last year, they're now doing. Now, the CCP did not collapse for two reasons. One of them was that the Chinese Communist Party said, hey, doors are open for foreign investment. Look at all this disaster we just had. Look at all these floods. We need to rebuild China. We need to rebuild our economy. Now's the time to pour money into China if you want to get rich. And all these foreign investors, Wall Street, poured money into China. The Chinese Communist Party is being propped up right now by foreign investment. It was foreign investment that bailed out the CCP. It's Wall Street that bailed out the CCP, corrupt banks that bailed out the CCP, corrupt businesses that have bailed out the CCP. And the CCP is still here right now because of that, because that was allowed to take place. The other big thing they're doing with this that has allowed them to stay in place is, well, they got rid of Trump. And the Biden administration has kept some of the momentum that Trump started when it comes to sanctioning CCP leaders for human rights abuses. They've kept in place a lot of the sanctions and tariffs, including some of the big ones, including against Huawei and chip manufacturing. And so some of that's kept in place, but they're not as aggressive as Trump was. They're not calling them names on Twitter. They're not, basically waging an ideological war against them on like a daily basis, like the Trump administration was, and they're not being as proactive or aggressive with it. They're keeping it, they're maintaining it a little bit, but not to the same extent. And the CCP can get some latitude because of that to maneuver around it. I would say the CCP is still deeply unstable because of all the things we just discussed, but because of foreign influence, through the CCP's subversion of politicians, journalists, think tanks, college professors, and other experts around the world, including actors and so on, and big company heads and so on. They're able to use these systems of influence, this network of influencers around the world, the elite of the world that they have subverted, in order to create the illusion of power. And it's this illusion of power that does drive investment and drive capital into the country, which they've gotten. And so it's that is keeping the CCP up right now. It's these factors, not the internal factors, but the external factors, that's basically keeping the CCP on life support. Essentially, that's the situation right now. Let's do one more question, and then we'll go into a couple more stories because it's getting late. This is from Gregory Yankee. You said, will you please make your series on the history of communism downloadable so that history teachers can use it in class? I want to show it to my high school students second semester. They need this information. That's a great suggestion, actually. We're working on a few different ideas with Epoch TV right now, and so we're working on a lot of stuff like this. We'll see what we can do with it. We also have our Defending America initiative, which we're moving forward with as well. And we're even talking about creating maybe some things that teachers can use to teach classes with that. We'll see what we can do. This is being considered. That said, folks, random idea that I've been discussing with my team. If we were to start a book club, would you folks be for it? Would you be interested in a book club? Just an idea. If we were to do it, we'd probably need a forum. We were talking about maybe something on Epoch TV platform because we're looking into the idea of creating a forum for Crossroads and other channels. Would you all be interested in the book club? And maybe once a month we could read a book. Because I know you've been talking about me doing a book list for you all. What about a book club? Just an idea. I'm playing with the idea in my mind right now. I just want to run that idea by you. I kind of want to do it. All right, a lot of yeses here. All right, let me think about how we can make it happen and what steps I would need to do for it and how we could run it. I think it's a great idea. All right, that said, let's jump into some more stories for the night because I want to talk about what's happening with Afghanistan. And, there's always more stories to talk about than we have time for, unfortunately. But I want to give some updates on Afghanistan right now because there's two possible trajectories with Afghanistan. One is, and both relate to the Chinese Communist Party and its influence over the Taliban. Now, remember, the Chinese Communist Party has for a long time. Let's go back in history. The United States launches the war against terror, right? Bush says you're with us or you're against us. France says we're not going to join it. Bush goes against France. We try to rename French fries freedom fries. Europe gets very unhappy and people think it's ridiculous that we want to call French fries freedom fries. Remember that? But a lot of countries get behind the United States in this war against terror. And one of those countries was, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party. One of those systems was the Chinese Communist Party. But the CCP, as part of this alliance, never actually fought against terror, never got involved with this. What the Chinese Communist Party did instead was started mining operations in Afghanistan. They started making profit from it, while the rest of the world was fighting against terrorism, fighting against these totalitarian, murderous systems, right? The Chinese Communist Party was working with them and making a profit from it. That's what they were doing. The CCP, while we were fighting against terrorists, was working with the terrorists, at least to some degree, making diplomatic agreements, making sure they don't attack their mining operations and things like this. They were making a profit from it. And we see that now that the Taliban is taking over, what did the CCP do? As you have right? Taliban fighters, terrorists, going through the country, going into villages, taking 12-year-old girls, forcing them to become brides, killing people, going door to door, launching attacks, seizing people's firearms, saying no more need for this, folks. You don't need guns anymore because we're in charge now. Look how safe you are, while at the same time launching their own purges against their enemies. Now, this is all being done under the protection to some degree under the Chinese Communist Party, which has made diplomatic ties with the Taliban and which invited Taliban representatives to China just prior to all of this, importantly. Now, there's two different ways that this can go. I've been mentioning previously that some individuals, some of the top advisors to the Chinese Communist Party have stated publicly, we reported this previously, that the CCP, in order to basically keep the U.S. in check and possibly start a war, which they have been talking about. We just discussed this assault trainings they're doing, these assault drills they're doing. The Chinese Communist Party is saying that in order to protect itself, essentially, especially if a war would ever take place, they need to keep the U.S. involved in 4 wars. Now, the war on terror was one of those wars. And it's in the CCP's interest to keep the U.S. engaged in a war on terror. Now, that's one possibility, that the CCP may try to, or have interest in at the very least, keep the United States engaged in Afghanistan. That is one possibility. The other possibility is just restarting terror networks and so on, like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which the Biden administration is also warning about as well. And keeping those essentially as a mechanism to keep the U.S. engaged in the war on terror, maybe not necessarily in Afghanistan. One possibility is they try to keep the U.S. stuck in Afghanistan. That's one possibility. The other possibility, which is probably going to happen regardless, is the CCP wants to make Afghanistan basically a propaganda pet project. Because, folks, what happens when the terrorists run the country? Well, fighting against the terrorists is no longer an issue if you're working with the terrorists. The Chinese Communist Party wants to work with the Taliban. If they're working with the Taliban, who are the terrorists? Who are going to be the ones fighting against them? Probably people against the Taliban. Probably the anti-terrorists. The people challenging the stability and social stability of the terrorist-led government are going to be the ones regarded as terrorists by this new system. And the CCP could assist in that. And in their propaganda, they could say, Taliban, or Afghan government helping suppress extremist movements, helping suppress extremist things. While at the same time, they could assist the Taliban in infrastructure projects like Belt and Road Initiative types things, freeways, and so on. Modernizing the critical infrastructure of Afghanistan, and especially creating systems where they could bring an oil pipeline maybe from Iran into China, because again, you're dealing with a country bordering on Xinjiang, which the CCP, or East Turkestan, whatever you want to call it, where you have the persecuted Muslim Uyghurs. The CCP has a lot of financial interest here. A lot of strategic interest here and a lot of propaganda interest here, because if they can make Afghanistan stable under terrorist rule, which is the irony of it, basically meaning the bad guys run the country, right? If they can make it stable under terrorist rule, it means that the Chinese Communist Party can, say, look what we did, look at how we succeeded, where the Soviets and where the Americans failed. That's the narrative they can use. Now, there's a few important stories with this that play into the possible trajectory of this. I'll go over briefly just a few headlines. We won't go into them. It says here, U.S. threatens overwhelming force if Taliban interferes with evacuations. Another one says, U.S. troops to continue evacuations of Americans in Afghanistan until we get them all out. According to Biden, the Secretary of Defense is saying that the U.S. cannot collect large numbers of Americans from Afghanistan. And at the same time, they put now armed F-18 fighter jets on standby amid the Kabul airport crisis where people are trying to escape the country. Now, a few important points on this, why this matters. The United States is threatening overwhelming force if the Taliban interferes with the evacuations, and is saying that now that the U.S. troops are going to continue evacuations of Americans in Afghanistan until we get them all out, according to Biden. Now, you have 6,000 additional troops currently deployed to Afghanistan to help with the evacuations. Mainly, seems to be around the airports where people are evacuating. The Taliban allegedly is helping facilitate some of this, although there's reports saying otherwise, meaning the Taliban is restricting certain people from accessing that. Now, As this happens, the Taliban is also warning the United States. They're not saying what the consequences will be otherwise, but they're warning the United States that all U.S. troops have to be out of Afghanistan by September 11th. What happens now if they don't evacuate all these Americans by September 11th? Because Biden is now saying that these troops are going to remain in Afghanistan until we get all the Americans out, until we get them all out. Now, at the same time, the Secretary of Defense is saying the U.S. cannot collect large numbers of Americans from Afghanistan. And so if we can't fully do this, if the ability to do this is limited, can we, and Biden saying we're not going to leave till we get them all out, what is the time frame for this? How is that going to work? At the same time, if the Taliban does do something or interferes with these evacuations, the United States is threatening overwhelming force if the Taliban interferes with these evacuation operations. And at the same time, they put armed F-18 fighter jets in place to possibly launch airstrikes if necessary, if that is to happen. A few of you are asking why 9/11. September 11th, that was the terrorist attacks against the United States, the Twin Towers, which Bush used, of course, as the excuse to start the war on terror, including the, you had special forces in Afghanistan, right? You had special operations forces there prior to that. But they did use that as the way to basically start the war on terror, which brought a lot more U.S. troops to Afghanistan, basically. And so for them, for the Taliban, that is kind of the key day, not necessarily about the terror attacks, maybe that's part of it as well, but the key day that kind of signaled the start of the full-scale operations in Afghanistan. And so they're saying September 11th is a key date for it. We'll have to see how this moves. One important thing to consider is it more in the interest of the Taliban or the CCP to keep the U.S. there or to get them out? Very likely the Taliban has it in its interests to try to become as legitimate of a government as possible, while again launching its own internal purges under the auspices and protections of the Chinese Communist Party, essentially. And the CCP also having significant control over the United Nations, which can act as a smokescreen to protect some of its operations as well. In terms of strategic interests, in terms of propaganda interests, it would be more in their interest to help all the Americans get out, end the whole thing, keep power, establish their totalitarian rule over Afghanistan, and play it from there rather than get the U.S. back engaged in these operations and risk their own deaths, which would probably happen. At the same time, the CCP would have it in its interest to keep the U.S. engaged there in some regards, but also the inkling of the greater temptation. The greater temptation here for the CCP, I think, would be to use Afghanistan as a propaganda program, an ideological example, showing in their own way the power of the China model, as they would call it, where they can help the Taliban basically implement a totalitarian communist system, much like the CCP has, in order to create social stability. And again, folks, it's the criminals running the country. The CCP itself is technically a gangster regime. It's a country led by the criminals, basically, just like the Taliban now is a country led by terrorists. And so if they're launching programs to restrain people from opposing their rule, essentially they're persecuting people who would be opposed to terrorism, just like under the Chinese Communist Party, it's people who are opposed to the gangster regime who they are suppressing. And so the propaganda possibilities the CCP could have to try to establish social stability and say, look what we did where the U.S. failed, I think has greater strategic interest to them. And I think that's more the trajectory we're very likely going to be looking at. But we'll have to see. All right, folks, that said, it's getting late, so I'll call it a night here. But real quick again, this coming Saturday, we're going to have the second episode of the Dark Origins of Communism series coming out. Going to be talking about the French Revolution, going to be talking about the Paris Commune of 1871, and a lot of information people have probably never heard before. The Jacobin clubs, some about the cult of reason. We'll get into all this stuff. Again, we're going to be doing a lot of shorter episodes talking about one issue at a time. Also, folks, on August 24th, next week, we're going to do a special live Q&A that's going to replace the normal live Q&A that day. We're going to be having 4 different guests. Gordon Cheng, may have heard of him, right? One of the top experts in the CCP. Gregory Copley, Casey Fleming, and Nansu, all great experts on China. We're going to be airing that a bit earlier than usual. Instead of 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time, it's going to be 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, that's August 24th, so be sure to tune in for that. All right, folks, that said, as always, appreciate you all. If you want to support this channel, again, check out Epoch TV, epochtv.com/crossroads. You want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about Epoch TV. As said, folks, as always, appreciate all of you. See you next time. As always, of course, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.